We all love the NFL draft. We spend countless hours talking about it every year, but let's face it, it's not the perfect event, and there are some things about it that can drive you a little bit crazy. I'm Glenn Naughton with JetNation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. I'm joined today once again by Chris Schubert of the Draft Network. How are we doing tonight, Chris?
Doing okay. We are getting closer. We are inside of a week, Glenn, inside of a week until the 2023 NFL draft, and we can completely overreact to whatever the Jets do at 13 or not do at 13. So this is my favorite time of year. I love the draft. You know me. This is what I do. This is my bread and butter, but I'm ready for it to be here. I'm ready to talk about some actual picks.
I'll tell you what, I can remember years past when I've been such a draft maniac since the Parcells days, since I was old enough to understand what it was. And I remember, friends that were like football fans, but not lunatic fans like us. And I would try to talk to them about the draft, and they'd be like, "Dude, I don't care about I'm not that into it." And I'd be like, "I don't know what's wrong with you guys. I don't know how you're not into the draft." Although I do laugh at the Bill Burr bit where he makes fun of people who watch the draft. I think that's fantastic. If you haven't seen it,
it's a good bit, yeah. No, it's a good bit. Yeah, it's very.
I have to laugh at myself every time I watch that. Yep. But as much as we love the draft, one thing I wanted to cover today, because of a couple of things, I'm listening to a million different podcasts at the moment. I want to hear what former GMs, former executives, former scouts, I want to hear what they're saying. Every now and then on these pods, you get folks who are commentators, but they've never worked for a team or worked in a front office. And some of the comments I hear really, really, I find them really hard to believe. And it almost irritates me. I heard it again the other day. I don't even remember which pod it was, and that's not the important part. But it was somebody, again, non-executive, not a former executive, said, I made some comments on my show the other day about player X, and some GMs called me to ask me about it. I'm not buying that. I don't care what network you work for. I don't care how many followers you have on Twitter. NFL teams have entire scouting departments. They've got local scouts, area scouts, regional scouts, directors of scouting. They've got the head coach, the GM, the coordinators. Every single one of those guys work together in unison to come to a consensus on which players they're going to take. But I'm supposed to believe that as the draft nears, Joe Douglas says, "Hang on, let me go call this commentator from Pro Football Weekly to find out what they're hearing from their supposed source." I don't get it, and maybe it bothers me more than it should, but I just listen and I'm like, isn't there something true that you can say that's interesting enough that you don't have to tell me that NFL GMs are taking a break during the busiest time of their year to call you and ask you, why did you mock? Why did you take Osiris Torrance that late? I just don't buy it. There are some folks who are 100% legit, who I 1,000,000% believe. Jim Nagy, Senior Bowl guy, he is talking to teams. The very nature of his role is to talk to teams. When he talks and says that, GMs are telling him or executives are telling him that Jackson Smith-Njigba is the only round one receiver in this class on their boards, I believe it. Doesn't mean every team has that, but I believe a lot of teams will. If Daniel Jeremiah, who's plugged in, former scout, if he says teams are telling him something, I don't have a problem believing it. But what do you think when you hear these people who are very clearly using that I'm hearing from GMs to kind of get themselves some street cred, if you would?
I will say that your biggest gripe or complaint about the NFL draft is very similar to mine, because there is a time on the calendar, and I will say that it was earlier this week, it's probably Monday or Tuesday, in which I get to a point where it's like, okay, I'm turning off most of the noise. I'm not listening to most of the stuff that's going on. We've got a big Rolodex of information. We've got a big Rolodex of film. We've got a lot of conversations that have been happening. In this last 7 to 10 days or so, a lot of what you hear is smoke and mirrors. It's the smoke screen season. It's silly season. And you have to be able to weigh these things properly, even from some of the big names you mentioned there, Glenn, because you don't know what necessarily the intent behind the information is. I'll give you a perfect example of something that happened just today that I don't put a lot of stock into because we have proof to the contrary. These S2 scores, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, less than a week before the draft, decided to leak. And they just so happened to show that CJ Stroud scored the worst out of anybody in this class. Out of nowhere, we've had these tests for a while, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they have fallen when we have a direct a piece of evidence to the contrary where the founder of the S2 testing model was on a PFF podcast, was asked about the top 4 quarterbacks, and said, yeah, they all tested really well. They all tested really good. And it's like, so he just lied there for no reason? He didn't have to do that, but he just lied for no reason? Again, you got to take the information as it comes in and put it through your own internal filter of, do I really believe this? Does this track with everything that has happened recently? And is this at a time of the cycle where it is a team trying to move a guy up or down a board to fit their interest? And so that's just a recent example of a piece of information that I see that the reporting on it seems pretty legit. But I go, nah, this doesn't pass the sniff test for me. Something's up here. And I think that's what we have to do. I think we all inherently need to be not biased against things, but to do our own homework, do our own information gathering to be able to vet these things and be like, do I really believe this piece of information at this time of year? Out of nowhere on a Friday, we're going to now all of a sudden we get the S2 scores. Now it's a big deal. I'm not buying.
I'm glad you said that. I heard you talk about that today on your TDN Daily podcast. I always try to listen when I can. Highly recommend it. But I'm glad you said that because my second one is a kind of a combination of my first and your first. And that is when we get not just the pre-draft rumors about, the negative things about guys. It's almost always quarterbacks. The fact that it gets a response and a reaction every year from and these are former players, like guys people who know the game, and I don't mean the NFL game, I mean the draft game and what teams do to get guys to fall, and they act like it has more credibility than it does. And this is what I mean by both our things tie in. As I just said, teams have entire scouting departments. They spend 365 days a year looking at these guys. They do all this homework, and then a tweet will come out from whoever, be it a legitimate journalist or a random person, that will say, player X had this issue, player B had that issue. And I just look at it and then I see the responses. Why are people trying to tear these players down? Why are people trying to hurt this guy's draft stock? Why are people attacking this kid? And I just think, are any front offices changing their boards based on a tweet about a test score? Like, I would imagine if those tests took place and the info's out there, they've already got the scores.
And that's the important part. The information that is getting to us is not the first, in most cases, is not the first time it's being heard among league circles, right? These conversations, I'll give you a perfect example, Glenn, that has nothing to do with the NFL draft. Recently, just in the last couple of days, Ian Rappaport made it very clear that the 49ers have been getting phone calls about Trey Lance. Jordan Schultz added to the report that he talked to a general manager and executive who said, "Oh yeah, this has been like the worst kept secret since Indy. We know they've been taking phone calls on him since Indy." It's like, Indy, that was a month ago. We're just hearing about it now in the middle of April. So again, there's stuff that goes on inside these league circles that we may be hearing it for the first time, but it's not the first time it's being discussed in those league circles. It's not the first they're hearing of it either. All of these teams are looking at the film. They're calling, this is probably a terrible example, but I love the movie, and so I think it's extremely valid. The movie Draft Day is a great example of what occurs here, right? They have a guy whose entire job is to look into the background of these players. Everybody has that. Every team does that for every single player, right? Do you know the thing about the playbook where they put the money in the playbook, that whole scene that plays out, right? They do things like that. They do things like that at the combine. They call the coaches, the college coaches, the high school coaches. They call teachers. They do all of this prep work on a player if they are seriously considering taking that player. Do you think now? Yes, there's always a chance that something could get missed. And the example that I think should always be brought up is the Laramie Tunsil tweet video on draft night. Right? Those are things you can't necessarily plan for. But your background search and the work that you do covers all of that. And so when teams enter their war room on draft night and are ready to make picks, they know a lot about every player that ends up being on their board. They know a lot about them. They feel pretty confidently in the player and the person that they're drafting in most cases. So I don't think tweets, again, it's great information. It allows us to be able to kind of take that information and put the puzzle together for ourselves. But I don't think it actually has an immediate impact because that work's already being done behind the scenes.
Yeah, and that's what I mean when I say it bothers me when former players who should know all of this comment on these tweets and they're like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you're hurting this guy's draft stock." And I'm like, are you really though? Like, are teams taking all the work they did all year on this kid and taking him off their board because of something someone tweeted that they probably already knew? That's basically my point. I don't think there's any real world impact on draft day. And it's another one of those things. Like if I found out from my GM that, oh, well, we didn't take this guy. You're like, we had him as our third prospect and he was still on the board at 13, but we didn't take him because a guy from this publication tweeted out that he was rude.
Bad process, right? It's bad process. And you would never, that process would never pass the sniff test.
If you're that, how much faith could you possibly have in your process if you're not drafting guys because of a rumor that somebody tweeted?
Which goes to show you that that's not what's happening, right? That's not actually how things are being done.
Exactly, which is why I scratch my head and go, why are players getting worked up about this? And like, who was it? A couple weeks ago, like, I saw these tweets. Will Levis is bombing in the interviews at Indy. Teams aren't very impressed. Who was it? I remember there was some stuff about Justin Fields that came out right before the draft. I saw, and it was stupid. I think it was politics, and I don't do politics. But there was like a journalist before the Jets took Zach Wilson. Oh, this kid is a brat, and he's not a leader, and he liked the tweet from the president. You can't. And I'm like, really? You think teams are putting that on their draft board? It's insane. Like they want to know if they can play football, and that's
correct. And they look into character stuff. They look into the person. They do all of that, and they put together a comprehensive report. It's not just about football. And like for us over at the Draft Network, when we do the scouting reports that we write up are just on the film because we don't have the ability, we don't have the insight that all these teams have, and that they can do all of this research. And again, I would trust everybody that's listening to this to know that the way the process plays out, these teams do a ton of homework on these guys. They're prepared. But at the end of the day, it's still an educated guess. Always is. No matter how prepared you can be, no matter how much film you've watched, how many people you've talked to, it is always going to be an educated guess. And I think that's the fun of this. That's the fun of that. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody can think they're the most prepared person in the room and they've done all the research and they've done all the prep and they've done all the scouting. And you may think there's a player that, boom, this guy's a top 10 player, no doubt. And then 3 years into the league, it doesn't work out. Like it's an educated guess. And to me, that's the fun part of it.
Yeah, you can Hall of Fame GMs have entire draft classes that listen, is there a more respected guy in New York, New Jersey than Bill Parcells? And
didn't do it every time, didn't hit home runs.
You look at the drafts, he had the good class where he had 4 1s, which is kind of hard to miss. But he had 3 drafts, I believe, where he had 10 plus picks and he found like 4 players. Out of like 33 picks, he found 4 guys. One of them was Jason Ferguson, who was a 3rd round grade, but he tested positive for pot back when it was a big deal. So they got him in the 7th round. And I mean, Parcells was on Idzik's level with most of his draft classes. And you ask any football fan in that area, and they tell you he's a football genius. He's a football god up there, and he's drafting like John Idzik.
You think Ozzie Newsome, every draft he ever did was fantastic? You think Howie Roseman, who is considered one of the best GMs in the league right now, does it every single year where he's hitting home runs? No, doesn't always work that way. It's an educated guess. The best GMs have more hits than misses, which allows them to keep swinging, allows them to keep doing it. But yeah, I mean, this is an inexact science. And again, that's the fun part. That's what makes it so much fun is you do all this work, you try to put the puzzle together, and then you get what the actual puzzle looks like at the end. And then you go, all right, this is just the beginning. Now we got to see what these guys do at the next level. And that's what makes the draft fun to me. It is the quintessential team building exercise and philosophical exercise of how you want to build your team. And so this is fun for me. But yeah, I'm done. I like it. There's nothing
parts. It's everything.
Exactly. And there's nothing really from an information perspective that's going to change my mind. Again, barring something like major between now and the draft. So I'm ready. We can make picks now. I don't need to hear the back and forth of what is Houston going to do it to, which quarterbacks. Like, I'm good. Let's just get to Thursday. Let's make some picks and then let's dissect them because that's what I'm ready to do. I'm pretty excited about it.
All right. One last thing I'm going to touch on that bothers me about draft time. And I experienced it a little bit yesterday, and I knew I would because it happens inevitably. As we discussed before the show, and I wrote an article yesterday, I'm now firmly in the camp of Jackson Smith and Jigba to the Jets at 13 as my preferred guy. That doesn't mean there aren't other guys that I love that I would be happy if they took. I like a lot of the tackles. I like Kalijah Kancey. I like Jordan Addison a lot. He was my wide receiver 1 up until about a week or 2 ago when I looked closer at Jackson Smith and Jigba. But when you, and I don't mean just like someone who writes for a site, anybody, just having a conversation on Twitter. And if you say, I think the Jets should do this at 1, the number of people who interpret that as the Jets should take that guy and then not draft anyone else. And they start yelling.
Where it ends. That's it. The draft's over there.
How can you ignore the offensive line and take Jackson Smith and Jigba? You're going to get Aaron Rodgers killed. I'm like, tackle at 42. Like, We got more picks. There's like 5 more coming. Might even trade down to 15 or 16 and have even more. Like the number of people, it always astonishes me who accuse you of ignoring every other need because the first need wasn't the one they wanted. It's wild. There's 7 rounds, folks. You might have 10 picks some years. Like settle down with our first pick is our only pick, and I can't believe you didn't take what I wanted.
Yeah, and here's the other thing that is very important, I think, to say here is that you can't address all your needs in the draft. Never going to happen. I don't care. I don't care how many picks you have. You could be the Houston Texans and have 12 picks. The Houston Texans have more needs than they do picks. They always will. So that's the way it works. You always have to plan for the future. You always have to think long-term when it comes to the draft. And deciding where the value makes the most sense for you in the draft could mean that you choose one position over another. I remember, Glenn, I'm old enough to remember when the idea of taking a corner at number 4 seemed ridiculous for the New York Jets last year. How could you take a corner? You need an edge. You need offensive lineup. How could you not take Ike Ekwonu inside the top 5 to be able to protect Zach Wilson? Hold on. Let me take my headphones off. I'm just going to listen real quick. Nope. I don't hear anybody complaining that the Jets took Sauce Gardner at number 4. Not a single complaint anymore. Let the process play out, folks. They've got a lot of picks. And yes, offensive tackle makes a lot of sense at 13. But who knows? Maybe they only like Paris Johnson Jr. and Paris Johnson Jr. is not on the board when they pick 13. So they go in a different direction. And then one of the other guys that they do like, maybe a Matthew Bergeron, is available to them at 42 or 43, and they make that pick. You got to let the process play out. Now, I will tell you, if you want to be mad at any point during the draft, if after day 2 they haven't addressed your need, I will give you permission to be upset, because more often than not, you're not going to get a starter on day 3 that's going to be able to be an immediate impact. So if you want them to draft an offensive tackle and they go the first 2 days, their 3 picks that they have right now, and they don't take that position, if you want to complain about it, be my guest. I would understand that. If you want them to take another wide receiver and they don't, and you're like, I'm not really sure about this wide receiver room now, you want to have that complaint, go right ahead. But let the process play out before you tweet online. Please, yeah. I'm begging you.
Exactly. And I mean, it blows my mind every year. Happens every year, but as it stands, the Jets have 6 picks. They still have those 2 seconds. We will see.
They're going to make both of them, Glenn. How about that for a prediction? They're going to make both of them. 42 and 43, Jets jerseys. Hold them up. It's going to happen.
I absolutely hope, and I hope there's a live stream into the Packers war room with Joe Douglas sitting back making his picks, because I still listen. We're not going to do another hour of Rodgers talk, but all I think with Rodgers is 1-year rental, and the Packers will have to pay him $100 million to not play for them. I can't see it. He can say, "Oh, my hamstring hurts. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to sit down, not play this year, and then I'm going to retire 5 days after the Super Bowl," which means between today and 5 days after the Super Bowl, they will have given him $100 million to not play. Can't see it happening.
Yeah, he's not. He's going to be playing someplace else. I shared with you in the pre-show that I'm starting to get a little concerned that this deal ultimately doesn't happen. But at the same time, there's some cautious optimism amongst me, because it feels as if like Woody is not getting in the way here. That like if a deal came to Woody's desk that had a 1st-round pick in it, Woody would be like, "No, we're not doing that." And like that's a weird comfort that I currently have. And so again, if that's where this is, also just want to make something very, very clear here. Just if the Jets make those 2 picks, 42 and 43, and they go the whole draft and the deal's not done, that doesn't stop them from making a deal. They could just make a deal for a 2024 pick, right? I mean, that's fine. They could do that. And then it's up to the Packers to determine what they want. But if they want to pick in this year's class, if they want one of those 2 twos as part of the deal, then they're the ones that have to move off of the framework, not the Jets. Again, I think the leverage play is still in the Jets' hand. It's probably 60-40. Maybe it's 65-35, but I think the Jets have more of the leverage here because the Packers don't want to pay that money. And if they truly want to get draft compensation for Aaron Rodgers, that is going to allow them to help Jordan Love this year, guess what? Clock's ticking. They've got 6 days to figure it out.
All right, so let's get into some players. We've talked about, everyone's talked about extensively about the O-line and how the Jets have to address it. Everyone knows about the Tippmann and John Michael Schmitz in the middle.
Would love John Michael Schmitz in a Jets uniform. I just don't think it's going to happen.
I like both of them a lot.
They're both good, but I love John Michael Schmitz.
Now, one thing that jumped out at me, because I like both of them better than this player, but a guy who I think doesn't get talked about enough is Ricky Stromberg. And I actually saw yesterday Brian Baldinger, former lineman, put out his top 5 centers, and he had Stromberg too, which really surprised me.
He's a name that's in the mix. Yeah.
To me, he's my 3rd guy. But having him there, is he a guy, again, we talk about positional value. Could he be there in the 4th round? I've seen him in that range in some mocks. And could the Jets basically say, look, we're gonna roll the dice, we're gonna go any combination of, let's say, tackle, receiver, edge with our first 3 picks, or a DT, maybe a Kalijah Canty type, and roll the dice that a Stromberg falls to 4. And if not, there's still a couple of free agent centers out there who are good enough. There's not a lot of upside. There's not a lot of future, Ben Jones, and you bring back McGovern, like get those guys on a 1 or 2 year deal and say, let's get a center next year if Stromberg doesn't fall to 4. Could you see them going with other positions with those top 3 picks and bringing back a free agent if they don't land a 4th round center?
100%. I think it's a position where specifically when it comes to different schemes, different teams ask the center to do different stuff. Sometimes the center is the one calling out the protections, right? I know in Miami, that's something that is done, right? Tua is not the one calling out the protections. Their center is. Some teams will leave that up to the quarterback, and the center is just kind of the guy that holds the ball there. And so depending on what you want to ask of your center, then that's going to determine which of these guys that you ultimately like. But, Glenn, you didn't even mention safety. You didn't even mention linebacker as 2 positions that I would even put in that list above center, because, again, I feel like there are a ton of free agent options that could make sense for the Jets. The guy that they had at center last year is still available in free agency, and they could just bring him back. And I'm here to tell you, did anybody complain about Connor McGovern last year? I know I certainly didn't. He was fine.
Yeah, he's not great, but he's far from
but serviceable. Exactly. Yeah, exactly what you want in the center. You want to not know the guy's name. You want him to just be out there and play, right? Also, this is very important. When you think of positions that are going to be, and there's only one roster cut down this year, but when roster cut down happens during training camp, I almost called it spring training because my brain is still in baseball mode a little bit. When training camp has those roster cut downs, like it's those depth offensive linemen that sometimes kind of get caught up in positional battles. Well, guess what? Joe Douglas seems pretty good at being able to maneuver around and be like, I'm going to take this guy off of this team. I'm going to pick this guy up and build a team that way. So I would say that I don't think center is necessarily a priority with the first 3 picks, unless a Joe Tippmann or John Michael Schmitz is available. I think there's a tier break there with those 2 guys. I really do. If those 2 guys are available, I think they'll strongly consider it. But overall, I think they'll look, and they did this. Max Mitchell was a 5th round pick, right? And they like Max Mitchell as a swing tackle. He ended up starting for them a good portion of the season. So they've shown an ability to identify some talent that they think could play for them in a pinch throughout the course of a season. So I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. It just wouldn't be on my top 3 list of positions that I think they need to address with those first 3 picks.
Yeah, I think and like I said, I've said all along that I would love Tippmann or Michael Schmitz or Stromberg, but I've also said a couple times that Connor McGovern's still sitting out there. Robert Saleh said at the owners' meeting, yeah, Ben Jones is the guy we might pursue. So there are veteran centers who are options that, like, I look at a guy, you talk about every year. Someone said the other day, I think it was someone PFF, maybe Sam Monsoon, I forget who. And I don't know if he's just throwing darts, but he kind of said, expect there to be a lot of, a few more Cole Strange picks this year in the first round. Like, expect there to be some guys that nobody's projecting in round 1. And even if he's not right, even if it's only 1 or 2, like, guys get pushed down the board. And if let's say you're the Jets and you're thinking in your mind, yeah, we'll take a Tippmann or a JMS, but then you come to 42 and BJ Ojolari is still on the board. I mean, are you going to pass on a potentially elite edge rusher for a center when you can add a veteran center in free? You're not going to add an elite edge rusher in free agency, but you can add a quality center in free agency and draft yourself an elite edge rusher.
This is why the piece of advice, and this is tough, right? And Glenn, I think you can relate to this. There are 2 hats that I have to wear when doing my job. There is the draft hat, where I'm looking at the class as a whole and looking at different positions and saying, okay, this group's really good because you have all these players. And then there's the Jets hat, where I say, what players, what positions make the most sense for the Jets? I don't lock myself into the idea of, man, the Jets have to get this player. The Jets have to get Y player, because you're making that statement, you're making that assumption without seeing how it plays out, right? You don't know who's going to be available for the Jets at 13. I have no idea. Glenn, I don't think this is remotely possible, but what if Will Anderson Jr. is on the board at 13 for the Jets? Like, okay, guess what? We have to have a totally separate conversation than the one we've been having for the last 6 months. Okay. Now, again, Will Anderson Jr. is going to be a top 5 player, but guess what? You have to wait until you're on the board at 13 and see who's available and then go from there. There are going to be players available for the Jets at 42 and 43. And I will say with 100% certainty, there are players that will be available for the Jets at 42 and 43 that I think should have already gone 10 picks in front of them. Okay, well, if that's the case, then you got to wait to see how it plays out to see what positions make the most sense for the Jets. Again, I know everybody wants a wide receiver. I know everybody wants to tackle. Everybody wants all these different positions, but you don't know what positions are going to make the most sense for the Jets when they're on the board. And if there's one thing that we do know, Joe Douglas will go get his guy. If he likes a guy, he's going to go get him. Traded up for Breece Hall, had him as a top 10 grade that class. Didn't they have top 10 grades on all 4 players that they picked?
I believe so, yeah.
Like they had a top 10 grade on Sauce, a top 10 grade on Garrett. They had a top 10 grade on Jermaine Johnson. They had a top 10 grade on Breece Hall. Those 4 guys, they got them when they traded up to the top of the 30s. They got 4 guys that they had on their personal top 10. If they want a guy, they'll go get him. And so that to me is the thing here is you got to let it play out because you don't know exactly what players are going to be available. There could be a scenario where a player starts falling down the board for whatever reason that opens up a whole new Pandora's box for a team.
Absolutely. And that's the big thing that's different this year to me, and this is what's going to make Joe Douglas's approach interesting. This is the first year he doesn't have a trove of picks, or at least the first time in a few years. I've said, maybe they trade down, and I know a lot of folks have said like, oh, that's not his MO. Well, his MO is he's usually working with 10, 11, 12 picks. Now he's working with 6. So does he like that? He might feel like they're good enough. He might say, look, I just need 4 guys in this class that I really love. So I will package those 2s to move up to 20 and grab another guy. So I get 13, I get 20. And then, another guy in the 4th round that I love. Like, I don't love that approach. I'd like some bigger numbers than that, but it just depends on how close they think. Think back to the, not that it worked out well, but the year the Jets drafted Sanchez. What did they draft? 3 guys that year?
Right.
Sanchez, Green, what was it? Slauson, I believe. Which he's another one. I thought of him earlier when you were talking about how teams, on the day and waiting how things unfold. I remember the story behind the Jets drafting Matt Slauson. Bill Callahan was, of course, the offensive line coach, and he knew Slauson a little bit from Nebraska. And I think the story was they hadn't even really scouted him. They didn't have anything in depth on him. But by the time they came up in the 7th round or whatever round he was taken, and it was their final pick, all their players were off the board. Everyone on their board had been drafted, and like literally they're on the clock. And Callahan is popping in game film of this guy to show them and say, look, I think this guy can be good. And Slauson turned out to be a pretty solid pro for being a 7th round pick. He played a lot of years in the league. So it's crazy how this stuff unfolds sometimes. Dylan and I talked about it the other night. You hear GM say it. Like, as much as we as fans have all these guys we love, we don't know what the Jets disqualifiers are. Mm-hmm. I have 10, 15 guys in this class I love. The work that you mentioned earlier, that teams dig down so deep on these players. Jalen Carter said it the other day. They're gonna go to your elementary school and they're gonna ask about you. They're gonna know just about everything they can. So if they uncover something that we as fans have no idea, and how many times do we find ourselves doing it? I'm guilty of it. Why is this guy still on the board? Why aren't they taking him? And then I have to remind myself, they know a million times more about this guy than I do.
And the other thing too is each team is going to have their own set of parameters, not necessarily from a character concern, but like there will be teams that will take a player off their board. I'll use corner as a position, right? If they don't have a certain arm length or they're not a certain height, they're out immediately. They're just not put on the board. And you may be sitting there going, Chris, what are you talking about? This player's awesome. Yeah, I probably agree with you that player X is awesome. But if player X doesn't fit the boxes that all these teams want to check, they're not going to take him. And so you have to use that information. I did a Brown show a couple of weeks ago. And the guy that I was on the show with, he shared with me some of the qualifiers, and he had a big spreadsheet. And he had, these are all the guys that I like. And then he went to another tab and it said, these are all the guys that fit the boxes. The list was in half. The list got cut in half just based on the preconceived qualifiers. And I will tell you, Glenn, I did some research while you were talking there. 3 players that year, Mark Sanchez, Sean Green, Matt Slauson. The next year, they only picked 4 players. And they also picked 4 players in 2007. Their first pick in that year was pick 14. They picked a guy by the name of Darrelle Revis. That worked out pretty well for them. So it's not how many picks you have, it's what you do with the picks. I do think they are in the worst possible spot from a value perspective. Trading down makes sense. I have been the person that has said it is not Joe Douglas's MO to trade down, but I do think it makes some sense, especially if they can get like a third round pick, what they don't have right now. So they can trade down and gain some capital in the third. I think that would be great. But again, it all depends. I just said it before. It all depends on who's on the board, because there's a player that they might love that they don't expect to be there at 13. But if he's there at 13, they are going to run the card to the podium. They are going to sprint it there.
Yeah, I think a team to watch is Tampa. How much do they like Baker Mayfield, and does Will Levis fall to 13? There are some people that say that Will Levis is a lock to the Colts, that they love him, and there are those who say he's not interviewing well, he's going to have a free fall. And all the pre-draft speculation, I say all the time, I learned my lesson. If you remember the year Matt Leinart came out, and I remember, I think I was at a ball game in St. Lucie, Florida that day, and I'm driving home, and I just hear this rumor, they're talking draft on ESPN radio or whatever. And the Jets are frantically trying to trade up. They want Leinart. He's the apple of their eye. He's their guy, blah, blah, blah. Draft comes. He's on the clock when the Jets are on the board, and they skip right over him. I thought, so much for that. Like, these are the insiders who I'm supposed to be listening to, who know what teams are doing. Like I said, that was my first reality, wake up to, like, they're either guessing or they're, teams are leaking stuff that they want you to know or that they want you to believe. So yeah, a lot of it is just cooked up, propaganda, I guess, if you will.
It's just that's the way it works at this point. I remember a year ago, and the guy I'm going to mention, I think he's very good at his job. I tend to be a defender of this person, even though most of the Jets media landscape does not like him. Connor Hughes last year swore up and down that they were not going to take a corner at 4. And I believed he did so with the best of intentions, that all of his information pointed to that they weren't taking a corner at 4. They took a corner at 4. Like, what do? You just throw your hands up and go, all right, I got it wrong. Sorry. Like, it is what it is. Like, they got me. They used me as the smokescreen. Like, it is what it is. But that's what you have to do in this space. You have to be able to piece through the information. And that's why there's a certain point, and it's basically arbitrary, where I just turn it off in my head and I go, all right, I cannot take any more information in and give it the same weight that I've been giving the information for the last 6 months of what has been heard at the Combine, what has been heard at the Senior Bowl, what has been heard in these interviews. There is now a time frame where there's an agenda behind the information, and you got to be careful with it. And so that's why I'm ready. Give me picks. I want to dissect the Jets' 3 selections on day 1 and day 2. That is what I would like to do.
Yeah, it's absolutely that time of year. Things are getting a little bit crazy, but it is what it is. We're less than a week away, like you said. So we're going to wrap things up for today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Glenn, I saw your tweet. I just want to make it very clear. I saw your tweet about Ivan Pace. I appreciate the tweet about Ivan Pace Jr., okay? I just want to make sure that we got that in there. We snuck it in there before the draft started, because it's a guy that I like. I like him a lot, and you pointed out exactly why I like him. I don't care how small he is. Go watch that clip that Glenn posted on his Twitter account. Dude can play. Dude, I get him on my team.
Yeah, I almost tagged you in that because we discussed him in the first show we did, and we both said his ability to shed blocks is better than anyone in this class. And
very good.
Again, everyone's always size, and it's funny that you mentioned it because you and I had talked about it, and then the other day listening to that pod, the Spielman pod, I think it's On the Clock. I forget what it's called. I should get the name if I'm going to mention it. I think it's On the Clock. And here's a former linebacker, and he said the only guy who sheds in this class is Ivan Pace. Linebackers today run around blockers. They're all athletic and they run around everybody. He said the only guy who sheds is Pace. And I thought, that's funny. Me and Chris just said a couple weeks ago that's why he jumped out. Small guy, does a great job. So interesting to see what round he's going to go in. And we'll have some actual real world, real life talk and picks to talk about the next time we're doing this. And thanks for tuning in for tonight's episode. Take care, Jets fans. And less than 1 week till the draft. Have a good one.